Gerald Horne, Morris Professor of History and African American Studies, University of Houston in Texas.
Well, thank you for joining us again. Second time you're on the podcast here. We're talking about your book that came out a couple years ago now, called The Counter-Revolution of 1836, Texas Slavery, Jim Crow, and the Roots of U.S. Fascism. I'd love you to begin by telling us why 1836, because I think it has a specific relevancy to the overall project and how you frame American history through Texas.
Well, the short answer is 1836 is when Texas secedes from Mexico, not least because Mexico in previous years under a president of African descent, speaking of Vicente Guerrero, had moved to abolish slavery, which was quite disruptive to the economic model of the settlers, spearheaded by Stephen F. Austin, Sam Houston, et al. And they styled themselves as walking in the footsteps of 1776, in fact. That was their mantra. Of course, what happens is that a bitter conflict ensues between the so-called Texas Republic, which was in existence from 1836 to 1845 when it enters the United States of America. But the conflict ensues between the independent Texas Republic and the government of Mexico before the former prevails. Now, when Texas prevailed, your audience should know that it was a blow against the abolition of slavery, not only because it meant the consolidation of enslavement of Africans in Texas or Tejas, but also independent Texas quickly became a major slave trading enterprise. The Lone Star flag of Texas between 1836 and 1845 could be found off the coast of Cuba. They were a major importer of enslaved Africans to Cuba. It could be found off the coast of Brazil. It could be found off the coast of Angola, the major source of supply in Southwest Africa. Obviously, this was quite upsetting to abolitionist forces in the United States of America. It was quite upsetting to abolitionist forces in the Caribbean, spearheaded by Haiti, the Caribbean nation that came into existence between 1791 and 1804, explicitly on a platform of abolition of enslavement of Africans. And independent Haiti was able to work out deals and arrangements with abolitionist forces in Great Britain in particular, then one of the more powerful forces on planet Earth. And that created enormous pressure on independent Texas, which caused independent Texas finally to run up the white flag and enter the United States of America circa 1845.
Yeah, that's thank you for that answer, because I think you framed the rest of the discussion very well. Because as reading the book, I found the book is basically a document of competition and violence and domination. And these threads between desperate groups play out among African Americans and African people of African descent, freed, enslaved, the Mexican versus the settler, indigenous versus indigenous in some cases, and Washington, France, England, Mexico. All of these forces are focused on Texas. And I'd love for you to tell us how that works itself out and how it makes Texas such a complicated playground, chessboard, maybe is a better word, for these tensions and political forces.
Well, as noted, there was conflict between independent Texas and the government in Mexico. They crossed swords. There was conflict between independent Texas on the one hand and Britain and Haiti on the other, diplomatic pressure in particular. There was pressure from indigenous nations I focus on the Comanches, for example, the erstwhile lords of the plains. I focus on the Kiowas, for example. But keep in mind that there's a separate narrative thread that's winding its way through this history. What I'm referring to is the so-called Trail of Tears, engineered by US President Andrew Jackson, wherein the Cherokees in particular, who had sought to assimilate into US culture, not only in terms of agriculture and dress, to a certain degree Christianity, and of course, most importantly, enslaving Africans. But that was not enough. They had to go. And so, along with a number of other Native American ethnic groups, they were forced to evacuate the southeast quadrant of North America, territory that's now embedded within Georgia and North Carolina, for example, in particular, and move westward to what was to be known as Indian Territory. Today's Oklahoma, now on the northern border of Texas. And so you had these independent Native American groupings on the northern border of Texas, which were not necessarily pleased with the genocidal impulse that was being executed by the settlers. Because I start the book, if you recall, with a basic conflict between grassroots settlers and governmental elites. The latter would have liked to have seen the indigenous on reservations. For example, Indian Territory, today's Oklahoma, was in many ways one big reservation, supposedly to be for the indigenous as long as the river shall flow and the grass shall grow. But we all know that that promise was not kept. In 1889, there was a big land rush by the settlers to seize land. And then by 1907, Oklahoma enters the United States of America, where it still remains. However, in contrast to this idea of reservations was this idea that the indigenous simply should be liquidated. And in many ways, that's the project that prevailed. I live here in the state of Texas. You would hardly know, I'm afraid to say, that a mere 170 years ago, this land was teeming with various Native American groupings, the Kiowa and Cherokees and Comanches and Apaches, for example. But that's hardly the case today. And so Texas was a snake pit of conflict. And to a certain degree, it still is, although admittedly not as bloody as it was in the 1830s and the 1840s.
Yeah, and I want to talk a little bit more about the idea you bring. It's in the book very strongly, is this idea of Texas secession. And I think you develop stages of secession in the Texas territory. And I'd like you to talk about how you developed this idea of secession and that ultimately leading to the Civil War. Because I think you make a really strong point that Texas was one of the linchpins of making the Civil War an inevitability.
Well, clearly, I mean, first of all, Texas had more territory than any other state in the United States of America, certainly more territory than any other state in the seceding states. And then Texas shared this land border with a foreign country, speaking of Mexico. And there hangs a tale, because what's happening in the run-up to the U.S. Civil War, 1861 to 1865, is that thousands of Africans are escaping to freedom in Mexico. You oftentimes hear, understandably, about following the North Star to freedom, that is to say, enslaved Africans in Maryland, for example, Virginia, evacuating to Canada following the North Star. But you had other Africans in Texas who were evacuating to Mexico. And that was complicating relations between Texas and Mexico, was complicating relations between Mexico and the United States. At a certain point, Texas felt that it could protect its most valued property, speaking of enslaved Africans, by not necessarily having to rely upon the United States of America. That was a motive impulse for Texas secession in 1861. And then, of course, after Texas secedes, you have the idea, or you have the project of Texas and a good deal of Dixie being supplied by pro-rebel forces in Mexico. Because simultaneous with the secession, you have a weakened Mexican government, a government weakened by repetitive conflicts with Texas, being taken over by France. And France had this idea, or to put it drolly, or perhaps to put it cynically, that they liked the United States so much, and like Republicans in North America so much, they'd like to see two Republican states in the United States of America, one headquartered in Washington and the other in Dixie. And so there was substantial support in French-occupied Mexico for a successful secession, which leads to supplying Texas and Dixie throughout the war. Perhaps the war would not have lasted that long, but for the supplies from French-occupied Mexico. So this is the conflict that ensues. And if you don't mind, since I'm on this thread, let me make a point about Juneteenth. Jumping ahead to June 19th, 1865, now a federal holiday. That is to say, the day, as the story goes, when supposedly Black people in Texas found out about the Emancipation Proclamation of Abraham Lincoln coming into effect January 1st, 1863. But like many, I'm afraid to say, popular histories, this is a popular history that has holes in it. That is to say, the Emancipation Proclamation only applied where the United States government was not ruling. I mean, it's like you hear these stories about enslavement in Mauritania and Northwest Africa. And so you would have the Congress passing a law saying that all enslaved in Northwest Africa are free. Well, the United States has no jurisdiction in Northwest Africa. So you could say perhaps that it's an admirable sentiment, but it's difficult to say that it has the force of law. And so likewise, the Emancipation Proclamation did not necessarily have any force in Texas. It only had force when, after the surrender of the so-called Confederate States of America in April 1865, you begin to see the U.S. forces in blue move into Texas. And this is where the story gets striking and intriguing, because the enslavers in Texas felt that Appomattox, the surrender, was not necessarily in their best interest, and that in league with French-occupied Mexico, they could fight on. They could continue enslavement. And so Juneteenth was in some ways a signal that Washington was going to be hostile to this idea of slavery continuing in Texas, even after the Confederates as a whole had surrendered in Appomattox. And to fast forward, I think it's fair to say that there's another Juneteenth that makes this holiday worthy of celebration. I'm speaking of June 19th, 1867, when the French puppet leader in Mexico, Maximilian, is captured by progressive Mexican forces in league with US forces and is deposed and executed. And my conclusion is that with regard to the abolition of enslavement in Texas, June 19th, 1867, most likely carries more force than June 19th, 1865.
Yeah, and you anticipated one of my questions, so thank you for answering it. The other, kind of backing up though, I found the history that you uncover about Texas during the war incredibly fascinating, because it seems like everything that you outline in the book, Texas contains multitudes. And there were Native Americans who were fighting with the Confederates. There were African American slaves fighting with the Confederates. There were Black regiments fighting in Texas against the Confederates. Can you untangle some of this for us? Because it seems incredibly contradictory and counterintuitive to kind of what we think of.
Well, it's probably fair to say that the enslaved on the side of the Confederates were mostly cooks and supply forces, not necessarily forces with rifles in their hands. Certainly, you had Black soldiers on the Union side, on the Lincoln side, with guns in their hands, who were fighting the Confederates. Likewise, the indigenous were split. Recall what I said a moment or two ago about the indigenous nations in Indian Territory, now the state of Oklahoma. Many of them, as noted, were enslavers themselves. In fact, by some measures, the last Confederate general to resign or to surrender was Stand, S-T-A-N-D, Watie, W-A-T-I-E, who was of indigenous ancestry. At the same time, you had indigenous who were opposed to the Confederacy. At the end of the day, however, I think it's fair to say that other than the enslavers who overplayed their hand, they overplayed their strength, which is understandable because enslavement of Africans had been in play and had been a force for hundreds of years before the 1860s. And it took a fertile and creative imagination to think that somehow it would disappear. And therefore, they were quite confident that this system of production would prevail. It was the major investment, the major capital investment in the United States by 1861. And it was difficult to imagine that poof, that property would be liquidated, billions of dollars in property. But alas, that's precisely what happened, which of course made many enslavers furious. They were expropriated without compensation. When the enslavers in what is now Haiti were expropriated, the Haitian government was forced to pay a kind of reparations to the French, which crippled the treasury for decades to come. When Britain abolished slavery in Jamaica, Barbados, et cetera, in the 1830s, the enslavers were compensated, with some of the descendants paid off as recently as about 9 or 10 years ago. But in the United States, when the enslavers were expropriated, they were not compensated, which leads directly to terrorism, the Ku Klux Klan, anger, fury, resentment, hatred, quite a bit of which we're still dealing with today. Although there is a footnote, which will be the subject of a book I'll probably publish next year. That is to say, in April 1862, the enslaved in Washington, D.C. were freed, and the enslavers were compensated. There was no reparations, of course, to the enslaved in Washington, D.C. In fact, President Lincoln was seeking to encourage the newly freed enslaved to leave the United States, to perhaps go to Liberia, West Africa, perhaps go to Central America, etc. So that's the exception with regard to compensation to the enslavers. And I dare say that I don't think there's been enough reflection in this country with regard to the consequences of this massive expropriation of private property without compensation. There has been an argument that it helped to fuel subsequent succeeding anti-communism because socialism was seen as a system whereby private property was expropriated without compensation. The precedent for that, presumably, was what happened in Dixie in 1865. And once again, I think that we need more study and reflection upon that momentous decision, which I dare say is continuing to shape events to this very day.
Yeah, and I would love for you to talk a little bit more about how that, without getting into presentism, of course, but the idea that some of these threads that we're still dealing with today. So like the racist project went from the violence of slavery to the violence of the Western expansion, to the mass murder and extermination of both African people and Native Americans after the war. And some of these demilitarized Confederate soldiers continued the ideology. And in many ways, the ideology never went away and has led today to a through line of fascism and totalitarianism and this very systemic racism.
Well, 2 points. One, just to complete a thought that I think I left hanging, the other loser as a result of the U.S. Civil War were Native American nations. In fact, what happens after the U.S. Civil War is that Black soldiers are recruited into the so-called Buffalo Soldiers and become the tip of the spear, ironically, in terms of pillaging and plundering Native American nations. And with regard to the subtitle of this book, which deals with the roots of U.S. fascism, I dare say that the bloodiness that was so prevalent in terms of building the United States carries a kind of proto-fascist impulse. And I would make the further point that going back to my comment a few moments ago concerning the liquidation caucus versus the reservation caucus with regard to the fate of the indigenous, the liquidation caucus was disproportionately comprised at the grassroots, that is, of common, ordinary, everyday settlers. I hope that your audience will not toss stones at me when I suggest that if you look at the Trump coalition, where at the top you have billionaires real and imagined, but as January 6th showed, at the grassroots, at the base, you have working class people, you have Euro-American middle class elements, and it mirrors, in a sense, what unfolded in Texas, whereby the energy and motivation for the most harsh, quote, remedies, unquote, to be inflicted upon the indigenous were coming from land-hungry settlers, many of them fresh off the boat, looking for the so-called American dream. Sadly and tragically, this American dream was constructed at the expense of many independent Native American nations.
And I think your point can't be overstated in that the loss of property and this continuing violence that never really abates, is a driving force in in the American project. It kind of is the underlying ideology, I guess is the right word, for almost everything that happens throughout this period of history. And I guess World War II might be the end of it, to a certain extent, of us killing each other. I'm not sure where you would locate it.
Well, I wrote a book on the origins of the United States of America. And one of the points that I made there, although in retrospect, if I were to write a second edition, I would expand upon this point, is that part of what infuriated the colonists and the settlers in North America circa 1776 was the so-called Royal Proclamation, or the so-called Proclamation Line, whereby London was seeking to establish a firm Western border that the settlers could not penetrate in terms of dragging London into continuing conflict with Native American nations expending blood and treasure. Well, as you look at the current configuration of the United States of America, from sea to shining sea, as the saying goes, obviously that proclamation line was obliterated as a result of 1776, as the settlers continued to move west into Texas, and then waging another war against Mexico, 1846, which then allows for the takeover of California, now the most populous and wealthiest U.S. state, a population of 40 million strong, larger than the population of Canada, for example, with purportedly the fifth largest economy on planet Earth. So fortunately, I'm happy to report to your audience that there is a movement to redraw and retell the story of the history of the United States of America by historians. The problem is that it's infuriating many on the right who feel that the story, the old-time religion about the founding fathers who walked on water, the likes of which we have not seen before or since in this God-given country, blessed by the Almighty, they prefer that story, not the kind of bloodiness that historians like myself are now detailing.
And just to wrap up, I think it would be helpful if you would explain why challenging that myth and that narrative that the conservatives are actively fighting to preserve today in libraries and school boards and all over the country, why challenging that offers a better explanation for America?
Well, if you visit your physician and you have problems, it's very important for your physician, if that physician is going to make an adequate diagnosis, to have a firm grasp and understanding what your problem is. If you go to the physician and you have a spot on your lung, but you fail to tell the physician that you've been smoking 3 packs of cigarettes for 30 years because perhaps you feel that makes you look bad, well, that will probably lead to an inadequate diagnosis, an inadequate prescription, and perhaps an early grave. I think that if we are to solve the manifold problems now afflicting the United States of America, we need a firm grasp and handle on what the problems are historically. That way we can make an adequate diagnosis, come up with an adequate prescription, perhaps to save this patient.
Well, thank you for all the diagnostic work you're doing on our behalf and the wonderful books you're producing that give us a better understanding of our history. So looking forward to what else are you working on besides the book on Washington?
Well, I have a book on Southern California that actually comes out this week. Look it up. And as I said, next year, my next book after that will be on slavery in Washington, D.C.